Welcome back to another video. In this one, we're going to be talking all about summer walleye fishing. We're actually going to run through 15 different tips that'll help you catch more fish in the summer. So there's going to be 5 from Jason Mitchell, 5 from Brad Hawthorne, and then we're going to wrap the video up with 5 from me. So without further ado, let's just jump right in, get right into it. I'm going to pass it off right now to Jason Mitchell.
Let's talk midsummer walleyes. Obviously you get in the middle of summer, dog days of summer. Obviously the fish have a high metabolism. These fish are eating all the time, but you know what? Sometimes these walleyes aren't always easy. And so just a few tips for catching more walleyes, particularly on natural lakes where you got the boat traffic, you got the recreational boats driving around. Some of these bodies of water, you might have to get out here early in the morning or late in the day to catch fish. There's other bodies of water where you're going to catch way more fish after dark. That's just the reality, okay? You have to do what works. But a couple of tips that I've seen over the years for just catching more fish on natural lakes. A lot of these lakes do have good weed lines, especially some of these lakes that have zebra mussels. These weeds just keep pushing out deeper and deeper. Septic tanks have changed, water quality has changed where we're seeing a lot deeper weed line. And so find the outside edge of the weed line, and basically what you're looking for is you've got the wall of weeds where these weeds are growing really tall. Then on the outside edge you get these clumps, okay? Look to see where the sun's at and look for where that wall of weeds creates a shadow and fish that shadow, fish the shade. And a lot of times you're just running a live bait rig. This is just a new tungsten bullet weight from Northland fishing tackle. And I've got a pretty long snell on here for just using a full night crawler. I pump some air into it, but sometimes I'm running a real short snell, just something that'll snake through those weeds, fish the shade on those tall weeds. Don't be hesitant to fish that main lake deep structure with a glide bait, okay? Here's something that we're starting to realize with forward-facing sonar that I didn't understand so much before. Later on in the summer, for whatever reason, it seems like these fish are relating off of structure, but they're a lot higher up off the bottom than I ever envisioned, okay? I used to drive over these fish with 2D sonar and see them 2 feet off the bottom and think, well, my bottom bouncer and spinner will go right over the top of those fish. I didn't realize that the fish was pushing, or the boat was pushing those fish down to the bottom, and I didn't realize that those fish were 8, 6, 7 feet up off the bottom before I drove the boat over the top of them. And so a lot of times when I'm throwing a jig or whatever at them, I'm fishing below the fish. And what happens with a glide bait is as you're snapping that bait, that glide bait's coming up in front of the fish, and then those fish are chasing it down and pinning it to the bottom. And so that's what we're starting to see, or starting to understand better. It's not like a big reaction, just that type of bait goes up in front of the fish and those fish chase it down and they hit it as it hits the bottom. And so baits like this pitch and puppet work phenomenal well for that. And so main lake structure, clean bottoms, deep water, don't be afraid to throw a glide bait around. One final tip, we talked about fish in the shade, as far as where the tall weeds are. We talked about main lake structure using glide baits. Sometimes don't be afraid to go right into weeds, especially if you have good cabbage, if you have good stands of coontail. A lot of these walleyes are living in weeds, and a lot of these walleyes are a lot shallower than what a lot of people would ever imagine. And the big thing is when you get less than 12 feet of water, to me that's where the last secrets are left on the lake, in the sense that the contours aren't as obvious. A good spot in 7, 8, 12 feet of water doesn't jump out at you necessarily like a big reef or a hump or a point out in the middle of the lake. And so these spots don't get as much attention. That's part of it, just finding spots that for whatever reason most people overlook. And so when it comes to fishing weeds in particular, it's tough to beat the soft plastic combination. So just a jig and a soft plastic. Here's the new eye candy jig crawler. And the reason we're using soft plastics and weeds, it's very durable. You make weed contact, you got to snap this, you got to pop this. A lot of times these types of jigs, when you're fishing weeds, it takes a little bit more twitch, where you got to be popping it when you make that contact. And the other thing, when you're using soft plastics, use braided line, fluorocarbon leader, just so you can pop and twitch that jig through weeds. But don't be afraid to fish weeds, especially if there's wind blowing on it. Don't be afraid to look for the shade on deep weeds. And when you're looking for main lake structure, don't be afraid to use these glide baits and try to pick off these fish or position up higher off the bottom, because typically that's what you're going to find a lot of later on in the summer.
All right, so that was 5 really good tips from Jason. Now we're going to pass it off to Brad Hawthorne. He's got some really good information. He's going to start out talking a little bit about his process of finding fish. It's kind of a 3-step process, so those are going to be your 3 first tips. But I don't have to explain it anymore. I'm going to pass it off to Brad right now.
Okay, my first tip for summertime walleyes, and any fish for that matter, is technology has changed so much. When I started guiding 20 years ago, you know, we didn't have side imaging. We had 2D and it was 200 kilohertz, and we had some basic mapping, usually in, you know, 3 to 5 foot contours. 5 to 10 was kind of the norm. So my breakdown of how is I start with mapping, no matter what that is. Okay, I look at the map, I think where are the fish going to be based on history in my head. Then I go to side imaging, I go to those areas, and I open my eyes wide open. 100, 120, 130, 140 feet on my mega side imaging to look, scan these areas and make sure there's fish. Once I've found fish, I drill down on those fish with Mega Live forward-facing sonar. And again, it doesn't matter what brand you're using, but that's the recipe. Those 3 things: mapping, side imaging, forward-facing. That's how I dissect just about every species of fish that I guide for, and it works extremely well. Now, what you'll see is there's a lot of guys that are wasting a lot of time. They go out with forward-facing sonar and they start scanning these big tracts of structure, and they spend half their time looking and not catching. When I could go through the same piece of structure with side imaging, either auto chart live and map the whole thing, or scan it the whole time and know exactly where the fish are, lay a waypoint on my map, and go back with forward-facing sonar. So that's my key, is really itemize all 3 of those things into your fish catching regiment, and you'll catch more fish and you'll spend a lot less time doing it. Okay, my other one is don't decide on what you're going to do before you see the fish on your screen. Okay, this is all coming together now. So now you're on side imaging and you see a pot of fish that are 5 feet off the ground. Well, if I went out that day and said, oh, I'm just gonna pull cranks, okay, and the fish are tight to structure, 5 feet off, you're not gonna want to pull cranks around those. Those are gonna be spinner fish or bobber fish or just pitching fish. So don't go out with a predetermined notion on how you're gonna catch fish and what you're gonna use to do it. Let your screen tell you how to fish them. Are they trolling fish? Are they jigging fish? What are they? Whatever they are, let the fish tell you what they are, not you, because you're not the fish, they are. So let them tell you how to catch them and how to pull them out of the water. The number 4 is do not forget, or number 5, don't forget the live bait. As a guide, I don't have the luxury of going out when the barometer's right and the sun is right and the pressure's just right. I have to go out there and produce every day. And that revolves around me making my clients happy. What makes clients happy? Fish. So I always have live bait with me, especially for walleyes, because you never know when you're just gonna have to add that little bit of crawler, a little bit of minnow, a little bit of leech to your presentation to take that day from 20 fish to 30 fish. So unless you're in a place where it's not allowed, I always bring live bait, especially when we get into those dog days of summer.
All right, so that was 5 tips from Brad. We had 5 tips from Jason in the beginning of this video. Now I'm gonna run through really quickly 5 of my tips. So starting with number 1. Now, one thing that I don't personally do a good job of showcasing in videos is that trolling can be really effective, and you don't need very much technology. You just need a little bit of practice. The beauty of trolling is that you can cover water. It doesn't matter if you're using cranks. It doesn't matter if you're using spinner rigs. Trolling is a really great way to go out and catch something, because you're gonna find some active fish and you're gonna put baits in front of them. But for me, I generally do more casting, just because I find that trolling is a good way to catch some fish, but casting is the best way to catch the most fish. So that's why you've seen a lot of the big major tournaments, you know, go to a place where, you know, you're on Lake Erie. That's a traditional trolling fishery, and those tournaments are being won with casting now. So casting, great way to catch the most amount of fish, the biggest fish, all that. But trolling is a good way to just catch something. Not to say that, and I shouldn't even, I'm getting a little long on this first tip, but there are some fisheries where you can go and you can pull spinners and the fish are scattered all around, and you can go one after another after another. Because I know some of you are watching and saying, oh, well, when I go out to the Dakotas or my favorite lake in Minnesota or Wisconsin or Canada or whatever, like we just catch them one after another trolling. I'm not saying trolling is not great. Trolling can be really good. But casting is the highest upside option for summer walleyes. So from there, what I'm gonna do for tip number 2 is I'm gonna talk about, in my opinion, the best place to go and catch a limit of walleyes. If you're in it for the pan, if you want you don't care about catching a big giant trophy fish and you just want to get some dinner, for me, what I would say is I would target weed lines. On a lot of the lakes that I'm fishing, you know, there are different lakes that are kind of specialty lakes that fish differently, and that might be, you know, shallow rock piles, tips of points, stuff like that. But on most of the stocked walleye lakes that you're seeing across the Midwest here, but especially, you know, around where I live, it seems like the biggest population of walleyes are actually on those weed edges. And the beauty of weed lines is, even if you don't have electronics, if you're working along a weed line like that, eventually you'll run into a fish. But the thing about weed line walleyes is that I have personally found that for the most part, they're gonna be really stacked up. So I'm generally not seeing like one here, one there. When it comes to weed line fish, I'm seeing not very many fish for a while, and then boom, there's a pot of 12 of them. And then maybe not very many fish for a little bit, and then, you know, 2 or 3. So if you catch a walleye on the weed line, work that area, try different presentations, and don't go too far, because those fish, they will move a little bit, but for the most part, those walleyes on those weed lines, they have the cover there that kind of holds them in place, and you can usually pick a few fish off of one particular spot. So go to the weed lines if you want dinner, but if you want to catch a big one, on a lot of the lakes that I'm finding, what that generally means is getting off of those edges and fishing out in the suspended water just off the outside of those weed lines. That's where you're finding most of the fish. Obviously, forward-facing sonar can be absolutely deadly in those scenarios, but what did people do to catch those fish before forward-facing sonar? It's going back to trolling, like we said in the first tip. Trolling lead core around the outsides, or even flatline trolling, and just knowing that your baits are running 10 feet down and we're going over 25 feet of water, and you're just looking for the fish that happen to be suspended outside of that break. So target those outside areas if you're looking for bigger fish. I promise you, you will not catch as many fish. You're probably not going to catch barely any eater-sized fish, but if you want to catch a bigger fish, and that's what you're in it for, look out off of the breaks on most of the fisheries that you're fishing. We're on Mille Lacs right now. You know, you could run into a 29-incher in the same spots as you're finding some of those eater-sized fish. There's definitely different lakes that fish differently than others, but on a lot of the stocked walleye lakes that I fish around home, that's where I'm finding bigger fish. The next tip, it's going to be super short, super simple. Keep your bait fresh. That's really key. So we got crawlers in the boat right now. Same goes with leeches. If leeches get too warm, bad deal. They're not going to last very long. With crawlers, you grab a crawler out of that little container. You want to get that container back in your cooler right away. Always have ice with you when you're out on the lake. You want to keep your bait cool, because if it gets too warm, they basically become worthless. So that's tip number 4. And then tip number 5, what did I have for tip number 5? Oh yeah, this is what I had for tip number 5. Always have a bobber ready. Bobbers are just ridiculous, deadly weapons. It doesn't matter if you're fishing a flat, you know, and you're in an area where there's some walleyes swimming around, you can just soak a bobber out there. And generally, if you're in a fishy area, something will come along and take a bite of it eventually. Walleyes on flats are roaming, you know, they're always on the move. They don't necessarily have any cover to hold them in one spot. And if you just soak a bobber in a decent area, something will come along. You can set up on the tip of a point, drop a bobber. If you have a forward-facing sonar, you can drive around and cast bobbers at fish and pods of fish that are setting up anywhere, whether that's suspended, weed lines, points, inside corners, up on tops of weeds sometimes, even if you set them up shallow enough. But the beauty of the bobber is it takes your jig and a leech, jig and a crawler, plain hook and some sort of meat variation, and you can just dangle that right in front of the fish's face for as long as you need to. It doesn't work every single time, but it works a lot. So always make sure you have a bobber tied on. So that is 5 tips from me. We had 5 from Jason in the beginning, 5 from Brad Hawthorne in the middle, And yeah, that's about all we got for you in this video. If you enjoyed it and you learned something, make sure to hit that little red subscribe button down below, because we have a lot more awesome content coming in the future. And until then, we will see you in the next one.